Hey guys, it's Kristi, and it's time for A Different Atheist Reads, A History of God by Karen Armstrong. So let's get going. Before we get started, a little housekeeping. As I came to the end of chapter 2 and I looked back, I started the book in September of last year, like the middle of September. And I put out, I think it's going to be pretty close to 20 videos just to get through the introduction, chapter 1 and chapter 2. And I'm really enjoying the series, but at the moment, because Karen is just talking shit all the time, or enough where I don't trust her and I have to check everything, I've noticed that the amount of work associated with the series has been growing. So I think I just want to take a break, like, a semester break. We've had 20 weeks. That seems like a reasonable amount, and then take a bit of a break. The other reason why I want to take a break is because this is taking up energy and time that I want to be putting into looking into my deconversion research. So we're going to have this video. Then there's going to be another one. Don't worry, I'm not going to just leave you without a little bit of closure. I'll do another video next week that's going to look over chapter 2 and just try to figure out what the hell what happened in this chapter, what we were supposed to take away from it, and give a more coherent overview of the theoretical developments of the concept of God based on the attributes we identified previously. And then I'm either going to take like a 4-week or a 6-week break after that last video. So I want to do a bit more planning, but just as a heads up to let you know that's coming. I'm not going to disappear off YouTube. It's just I'm going to put the series on a break for 4 to 6 weeks. I'll make a determination and then let you know. That'll give me, I have a lot of ideas for my A Different Atheist, or An Atheist Asks, but I haven't had time to do the research necessary. So just a little break will allow me to do other things related to atheism and deconversion. And so I wanted to give you a heads up on that because I made that decision in the last week. So now that we have our plan set, let's go ahead and get started with the last bit of chapter 2. I wish I could say that there was coherency, but it doesn't. It's just Karen, again, rambling from point to point, moving, not any particular goal in any that I can find in her chapters. And in the last section, she starts off a little bit by providing some of the political context. So she starts with the rise of Alexander, and in particular in 332 BCE, where he defeated Darius III of Persia, and the influence of Hellenization, the Greeks coming in, occupying their language, their philosophy, their culture, their social norms, having a wide impact. That the Greek influence was very profound can be demonstrated by the fact that the Jews were even translating their own works from Hebrew into Greek. And I don't know if there's a good comparison, or this to me seems like the biggest comparison. Imagine if Spanish was such a major part of the American language, in the United States, that people were translating the Constitution into Spanish in order to communicate it. I think that is, for me, the impact of Greek culture on the Jewish tradition here, and the fact that they are actually moving out of their own language in order to speak the dominant lingua franca, as it were. Karen reports on the tension that happened because the Yahwehists were of the opinion that other gods didn't even exist, that their only God was their God, the true God was Yahweh. They were labeled as atheists because they denied the existence of other gods. Karen points that out. And she makes a point of slightly contrasting the worldviews. So in the Greek worldview, people can come to know God through reason and observing the world and using logic. And that tradition doesn't exist within Judaism, and how these two ways of knowing God, revelation or through reason, are going to start to come into conflict. Karen then spends quite a lot of time discussing Philo of Alexandria, and he lived from 30 BCE until 45 CE. Philo was a Jew, but he was raised in Greek culture, so he doesn't seem to have written or known Hebrew. He was trained in Greek. He has a Greek worldview, although he was raised as Jewish. The weird thing about putting Philo here, and Karen spends quite a long amount of time actually discussing Philo. I'm not going to go into the details because, again, it's just like a whole bunch of random things that are not connected. She just tells you things about Philo, and I have no idea what's going to really be important. You can read the book, but I'll highlight a couple of the things. But in terms of Philo being a thinker within the Jewish tradition, he just wasn't. I'm going to link in the description box a video that I found from a rabbi who talked about Philo. And really, until the 20th century, Jewish scholars didn't pay much attention to Philo. He was really important for Christians, but not really important for Jewish thinkers, and that doesn't come out as well. I mean, she puts one line in about that, but it seems to me that Philo would have made a lot more sense discussing Christianity than here, considering where we've come from in the course of this chapter, but, Karen just put stuff in wherever. What sets Philo apart from his Jewish contemporaries is that Philo seems more committed to a Greek worldview than a Jewish one. He seems almost, as Karen writes, embarrassed by the historical books of the Bible, and instead he turns them into elaborate allegories. So this is why Christians like Philo and why Jewish philosophers or Jewish scholars didn't really pay much attention to him. Karen discusses, and I'm going to go over this using just the regular terms, not the Greek terms, but she rushes through, in my opinion, the idea that Philo divided things into God's essence and his energies and his powers. So these are two distinctions that Philo makes in his writings. And on page 86, and I think it's worth quoting here, she does, after all of this discussion of Philo, going through Philo this, Philo that, Philo that, buried in one paragraph, she writes, "And indeed, Jews have always found Philo's conception of God somewhat inauthentic. Christians, however, would find him enormously helpful, and the Greeks, as we shall see, seized upon this distinction between God's unknowable essence and the energies that made him known to us." So, one little thing just talking about the fact that for thousands of years, people don't really rate Philo in the Jewish scholarly community, but, that's only a tad interesting to Karen. Then we have a very Karen claim that has to do with creativity. "We have seen that the conception of God has often been an imaginative exercise. Prophets had reflected upon their experience and felt that it could be ascribed to the being they called God. Philo shows that the religious contemplation had much in common with other forms of creativity." So, and no substantiation for this. This is just a Karen worldview. Karen spends what I would call a minimal amount of time organizing the political situation. So looking at the transition from the Greek rule and Jewish being in that the Jewish religion and people being in that context, and then the Romans coming in and actually initially kind of allying with the Jewish sects against the Greeks. And she talked about this, then a resistance coming up, and this going all the way to the Roman occupation of Jerusalem in 66 CE and all to the temple destruction in 70 CE. I wish I could tell you in the chapter she was doing this with some sort of purpose, but again, it just seems to be more information that she's throwing at us. In the next section of Karen's book, she really focuses on spending time developing the notion of the Pharisees without, in my opinion, really providing an appropriate historical context where the Pharisees fit in next to the Sadducees and the other sects of Judaism that were around at that time. Of course, she does this for a reason, and that's so that she can spend a lot of time talking about the rabbinic tradition and the Talmud creation in order to connect it to mysticism and the rabbinic tradition, and putting in, again, a lot of information where it just seems to be thrown at us without a context, just giving us more information about what she thinks people thought. To give you a flavor of what this ending section is like when she's discussing the rabbis, I'll just do a pulled quote. "This very important rabbinic insight meant that God could not be described in a formula as though he were the same for everybody. He was an essentially subjective experience. Each individual would experience the reality of God in a different way to answer the needs of his or her own particular temperament. Each one of the prophets had experienced God differently, the rabbis insisted, because his personality had influenced his conception of the divine." So this is the kind of stuff that you get just Karen making these various assertions without grounding it, not citing any scholarship, not providing a lot of footnotes. Typical Karen stuff, basically. And I found another one of the logical making sense quotes here, even on the end on page 94. "This was not because it was based on a sound theoretical foundation. Many of the practices of the law made no logical sense. The religion of the rabbis was accepted because it worked. The vision of the rabbis had prevented their people from falling into despair." So it doesn't really matter if it's true, it just matters that it makes you feel better. Near the end of chapter 2, Karen makes a weak-ass critique of sexism and patriarchy and misogyny in the text. We've already seen that she's made very little effort to include women, in her chapters in any meaningful way, other than to do occasional nods, throwing occasional bones to half the population. And she does this again by really covering up the true lack of autonomy and dignity that women had. This type of spirituality was for men only, however, since women were not required and therefore not permitted to become rabbis, to study Torah, or to pray in the synagogue. The religion of God was becoming as patriarchal as most of the other ideologies of the period. The woman's role was to maintain the ritual purity of the home. So, first of all, she writes, this type of spirituality was women were not required and therefore not permitted. I think women were not permitted and therefore not required. She's got that backwards. It's not like they weren't required to do it, so then they weren't permitted to do it. No, you weren't permitted to do it, and therefore you're not required to do it. And it's this sort of excusing patriarchy that is really, really disappointing, because she could have been a bit more honest here about women's dignity, but she wasn't. For instance, she really does not take up this observation that she makes. Even though rabbis taught that women were blessed by God, men were commanded to thank God during the morning prayer for not making them Gentiles, slaves, or women. And she really does not do any decent critique of that at all. She just lets it slide as if, oh, well, we wouldn't expect more from God. I don't know. Who knows what Karen is thinking? So that's really nearing the end. I mean, she kind of goes on a little bit more in her chapter, but she doesn't wrap it up with any major conclusions. She doesn't wrap it up with an overview of what the chapter has covered and how it fits into the major theme of her book. She doesn't discuss at all where the next chapter is going, and how what we've seen in chapter 2 connects to chapter 3. So because we can't really move forward until we've looked back to see where we've gone, what I'm going to do is just watch my videos, and I'm going to try to make sense of what Karen is trying to do in this chapter by watching my videos and summarizing that, because it's too confusing otherwise. So next week I will have that summary. I'll do a bashing of chapter 2 and what problems I have with it and what I think could have been done better, peer review kind of thing. And then we're going to take a little breaky winky. But again, it's only going to be for either 4 to 6 weeks. I'll give a date certain by the time of my next video, and then we'll definitely be still going strong with Karen's book in the summer, so you can look forward to that. Otherwise, thank you for your views, your support, and your comments, and I'll see you guys next Thursday on A Different Atheist Reads. I've been Kristi, you've been awesome, and I'll check you later. Bye.